Sometimes the people smiling the hardest are only one step away from disappearing. The wind screamed across the frozen Chicago bridge like something alive, slicing through the night at nearly 40 miles per hour as snow spiraled beneath the pale glow of the streetlights. Cars rushed past in blurred streaks of white and red, tires hissing against the icy pavement, but Ethan Cole barely noticed any of it. His hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his worn charcoal coat, shoulders hunched against the brutal December cold as he crossed the bridge on foot after another failed job interview downtown. The leather folder tucked beneath his arm was damp from snow, its corners bent from months of rejection. 3 interviews this week. 3 polite smiles. 3 versions of "we'll call you." They never called. Ethan exhaled slowly, watching his breath cloud in front of him. His boots were soaked through. His fingers burned from the cold. And somewhere in the back of his mind lingered the same painful thought that had followed him for the past 11 months. Noah would be turning 9 next week. The thought hit harder than the wind. Ethan swallowed tightly and kept walking. Then he saw her. At first she looked almost unreal standing near the railing ahead, her long camel-colored coat whipping violently around her legs as snow gathered in her pale blonde hair. She wasn't moving. She wasn't looking at traffic. She was staring down into the black river below. Ethan slowed instinctively. Something about the stillness of her body felt wrong. The bridge was nearly empty this late at night, and every instinct in him suddenly sharpened awake. He glanced around once. Nobody else seemed to notice her. A horn blared somewhere behind him, distant and meaningless against the roar of the wind. The woman stepped closer to the railing. Ethan's heartbeat lurched. "Hey," he called out immediately, his voice rough from cold. The woman froze for half a second but didn't turn around. Snow whipped between them. Ethan moved faster now, boots crunching across the ice. "Miss," he shouted again, louder this time. "Don't do this." Her fingers tightened around the metal railing. Even from several feet away Ethan could see they were trembling. She still didn't look back. For one terrifying second, he thought he was too late. Then the woman shifted forward slightly, and instinct took over. Ethan lunged across the slick pavement and grabbed her arm firmly just as her heel slipped near the edge. She gasped sharply, startled more than anything, and stumbled backward into him as the wind howled around them. Ethan held on to her tightly until both of them regained balance. His pulse thundered in his ears. "Easy," he breathed heavily. "Easy. I got you." The woman stood completely still against him, frozen in shock. Up close, Ethan noticed how thin she looked beneath the expensive coat. How exhausted her face was. Her mascara had smeared faintly beneath red-rimmed blue eyes, and despite the freezing weather, tears still glistened against her cheeks. She couldn't have been older than her mid-30s. Beautiful in the kind of effortless way magazine covers tried to imitate. But right now she didn't look powerful or glamorous. She looked shattered. Ethan slowly loosened his grip but didn't step away completely. "You okay?" he asked quietly. The woman laughed once under her breath, but it sounded hollow. "Do I look okay?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. Snowflakes melted against the dark stubble along his jaw as he studied her carefully. "No," he admitted softly. "Not really." Something flickered across her face then. Surprise maybe. Most people lied when confronted with pain. Most people rushed to say everything would be fine. Ethan didn't. The silence stretched between them while traffic roared behind. Finally she looked away first, wrapping her arms tightly around herself. "You should have kept walking," she murmured. Ethan glanced toward the river below before answering. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Probably." The woman frowned slightly, confused by his honesty. Ethan gave a tired shrug. "But I didn't." Another gust of brutal wind tore across the bridge, stronger this time. The woman shivered visibly. Ethan noticed immediately. Without thinking twice, he shrugged off his coat and held it toward her. "Here." Her eyes widened. "No, take it." You're freezing. Ethan forced a faint smile despite the cold already biting through his sweater. I've survived worse winters than this. She hesitated. Ethan could practically see the war happening behind her eyes. Pride. Exhaustion. Shame. Finally she accepted the coat slowly, draping it over her shoulders with trembling fingers. The fabric swallowed her slightly, carrying faint traces of cedar soap and old coffee. For the first time since Ethan grabbed her arm, her breathing seemed to steady. "Thank you," she whispered. Ethan nodded once. They stood there in silence for several long seconds, side by side beneath the swirling snow while the city lights shimmered against the dark river below. The woman stared outward again, but this time she kept a safe distance from the railing. Ethan leaned both elbows against the frozen concrete barrier beside her. "You got a name?" he asked eventually. She hesitated just a beat too long before answering. "Charlie." Ethan noticed the hesitation. Noted it quietly. But he didn't push. "Charlie," he repeated. "I'm Ethan." Another silence followed, strangely less uncomfortable now. Somewhere below them, a boat horn echoed across the river. Charlie rubbed her hands together beneath the oversized coat. "You always stop strangers from making bad decisions?" she asked softly. Ethan let out a quiet breath through his nose. "Only the dangerous ones." To his surprise, Charlie smiled faintly at that. It wasn't a full smile. More like someone remembering how to do it after a very long time. Ethan found himself staring for half a second too long before looking away. She noticed. He knew she did. "You don't even know me," she said quietly. Ethan's gaze drifted toward the skyline ahead, thousands of glowing windows towering against the storm. Sometimes you don't need to know somebody to know they shouldn't be alone. Charlie looked down suddenly, blinking fast as emotion flashed across her face again. Ethan pretended not to notice. The wind picked up harder. Snow now coated both their shoulders heavily. Ethan flexed his freezing fingers and glanced toward the far side of the bridge. "There's an old train station about half a mile from here," he said. "Probably warmer than standing out here turning into popsicles." Charlie let out the smallest laugh again, softer this time. "Realer. Was that supposed to be charming?" "Honestly?" Ethan said. "I'm too cold to be charming." She looked at him then. Really looked at him for the first time. His worn boots. The damp sweater beneath the missing coat. The exhaustion in his brown eyes he was trying hard to hide. And somehow that seemed to affect her more than anything else had tonight. "Why would you help me?" she asked quietly. Ethan stared ahead for several seconds before answering. "Because once," he said carefully, "somebody stopped me from giving up too." Charlie's expression changed instantly. The storm raged around them. Snow swirled beneath the streetlights. And for the first time all night, she took one small step away from the railing and toward him. The abandoned train station smelled faintly of dust, wet concrete, and old metal forgotten by time. Snow rattled against the cracked windows while freezing wind slipped through tiny gaps in the walls, but somehow it still felt warmer than the bridge outside. Ethan pushed open the heavy side door with his shoulder and motioned for Charlie to step inside first. Dim yellow emergency lights flickered weakly overhead, casting long shadows across empty benches and faded train maps peeling from the walls. Somewhere deeper in the station, water dripped steadily in the silence. Charlie wrapped Ethan's coat tighter around herself as she stepped cautiously across the worn tile floor in expensive black heels clearly not designed for snowstorms. Ethan noticed immediately. "Careful," he said quietly. "The floor gets slippery near the entrance." Charlie glanced down and nodded once. Her voice was softer now than it had been on the bridge. "You know this place?" Ethan shrugged lightly as he brushed snow from his sweater sleeves. "Spent a couple nights here last winter." The words landed heavier than he intended. Charlie looked at him carefully but did not respond right away. Ethan walked toward an old vending machine against the far wall and crouched beside it. After a second he pulled out a small flashlight and flicked it on. Maintenance guy leaves the side door unlocked sometimes during storms, he explained casually. People around here know about it. Charlie watched him move around the station with quiet familiarity, and for the first time she began noticing details she had missed on the bridge. The way he protected his left shoulder slightly when he walked. The frayed cuffs of his sweater. The exhaustion hidden beneath his calm expression. Nothing about Ethan looked polished or successful. But nothing about him felt dangerous either. That unsettled her more than she expected. Most people wanted something. Attention. Money. Status. Favors. Especially after recognizing wealth. But Ethan had not even asked her last name. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the city as snow battered the windows harder. Ethan glanced toward the storm. Looks like we are stuck here for a while. Charlie moved toward one of the old wooden benches and sat carefully, crossing her arms against the cold. Ethan disappeared briefly down a dark hallway before returning several moments later carrying 2 dusty paper cups and a small portable kettle with a cracked handle. Charlie blinked in surprise. You keep a coffee station in abandoned train stations now? Ethan smiled faintly for the first time that night. No. There is a security office in the back. Sometimes the night guards leave supplies. He held up a packet of instant coffee. 5-star dining. Something about the dry humor caught Charlie off guard enough to make her laugh softly again. The sound echoed gently through the empty station. Ethan froze for half a second hearing it. It was strange how different she sounded when she laughed. Lighter. Younger somehow. Like the woman on the bridge had briefly disappeared. Ethan busied himself pouring hot water into the cups while Charlie studied him quietly from across the bench. You really spent nights here? She asked after a moment. Ethan handed her one of the cups carefully before answering. Last February. Charlie wrapped both hands around the warm cup instantly. Why? Ethan leaned back against the wall beside the bench instead of sitting. Because sleeping in my truck during Chicago winter gets old fast. Charlie stared at him. Ethan said it casually, almost like he was discussing the weather, but she could hear the exhaustion underneath. You are homeless? She asked quietly. Ethan took a slow sip of coffee before answering. Temporary bad luck, he said. Sounds better than homeless. Charlie looked down into her cup, unsure what to say. Outside, another blast of wind shook the windows violently. Ethan watched the storm for several silent seconds before speaking again. What about you? Charlie stiffened slightly. Ethan noticed immediately. You do not have to answer, he added calmly. I am just trying to figure out what makes somebody stand alone on a bridge during a blizzard. Charlie stared into the dark coffee. The steam curled upward between them. You ever get tired? She asked suddenly. Ethan frowned lightly. Tired? Of pretending you are okay all the time. Ethan did not answer immediately. Charlie continued staring into her cup. Like everybody needs something from you constantly. Everybody expects you to keep smiling. Keep functioning. Keep carrying everything. Her voice grew quieter with every sentence. And one day you wake up realizing nobody actually sees you anymore. Ethan's expression softened slightly. He knew that feeling. Too well. Charlie swallowed hard and shook her head once as if embarrassed by her own honesty. Forget it. Ethan leaned his shoulder against the wall. No, he said quietly. I get it. Charlie looked up at him then, searching his face for pity. She found none. Only understanding. That somehow felt worse. Or maybe better. She could not tell anymore. Ethan rubbed his hands together slowly to warm them. About 2 years ago, he said carefully, I had a good job. House in Oak Park. Wife. Son. Everything looked pretty solid from the outside. Charlie listened silently. Then my company got investigated for cutting safety corners on a high-rise project. His jaw tightened faintly. People got hurt. Charlie's eyes widened slightly. Ethan shook his head quickly. Not because of me. I reported it. Thought doing the right thing mattered. He laughed softly under his breath, bitter and tired. Turns out companies do not love whistleblowers. Charlie watched him closely now. Ethan rarely talked about this to anyone anymore. But something about the storm, the empty station, the look in her eyes, it made silence feel heavier than honesty tonight. I lost my job first, Ethan continued. Then legal fees hit. Then my marriage fell apart 6 months later. He stared toward the snow outside the cracked windows. Funny how fast life can disappear. Charlie's grip tightened around the paper cup. What about your son? Ethan smiled faintly at the question, but sadness flickered through it instantly. Noah. Just saying the name changed his entire face. Softer. Warmer. He lives with his mom in Milwaukee now. Charlie saw Ethan glance briefly toward the worn leather folder near his boots. I drive up when I can. His voice lowered slightly. Birthdays. School plays. Stuff like that. He paused. At least when I can afford gas. Silence settled heavily between them after that. The storm outside continued roaring against the station walls while old fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. Charlie looked down at Ethan's coat wrapped around her shoulders. It smelled clean despite everything. Cedar soap. Coffee. Winter air. Safe. The realization unsettled her deeply. She had spent years surrounded by powerful people in tailored suits and million-dollar offices, yet somehow this exhausted stranger in a freezing abandoned station felt more genuine than any of them. Ethan noticed her shiver slightly and immediately stood. Hold on. He walked toward a storage closet near the back and returned moments later carrying an old wool blanket. Found this last winter, he explained while draping it carefully across the bench beside her. Probably survived since the 1980s. Charlie stared up at him in disbelief. You keep surviving disasters in abandoned places? Ethan smirked faintly. It is a hidden talent. She smiled despite herself. Then her eyes drifted toward his hands as he adjusted the blanket. They were rough. Cold. Slightly red from winter. Working hands. Real hands. Not manicured boardroom hands. Ethan caught her staring and quickly pulled away awkwardly. Charlie looked down immediately. Somewhere deep inside her chest, something painful shifted unexpectedly. Because for the first time in months, maybe years, nobody in this room cared who she was. And she realized with sudden terrifying clarity that she did not want this night to end. The storm outside seemed endless now, the snow piling thick against the cracked station windows until the city beyond looked distant and unreal. Midnight had long passed. The old fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead while cold air drifted through the abandoned station in slow invisible waves. Charlie sat curled beneath the faded wool blanket with Ethan's coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders, watching him from across the bench while he adjusted the tiny portable heater he had somehow managed to coax into working. The weak orange glow flickered against his tired face, softening the sharp exhaustion around his eyes. There, Ethan muttered quietly after a second. Luxury accommodations. Charlie smiled faintly into her coffee cup. This might actually be the strangest night of my life. Ethan leaned back against the wall beside the heater. Bad strange? Charlie looked toward the storm outside for a moment before answering. I am not sure yet. Silence settled comfortably between them again. Not awkward anymore. Just quiet. The kind of quiet two exhausted strangers sometimes fall into after surviving something emotional together. Somewhere deeper in the station, old pipes rattled softly. Charlie shifted slightly beneath the blanket and noticed Ethan rubbing his hands together again against the cold. He was pretending not to shiver now. She frowned immediately. You should take your coat back. Ethan shook his head without looking up. You need it more. Ethan. Charlie. His tone carried just enough amusement to make her stop arguing. She stared at him for a second before exhaling softly through her nose. You are stubborn. I have been called worse. Another small smile slipped across her face before fading again almost instantly. Ethan noticed the change immediately. You okay? Charlie hesitated. Her fingers tightened slightly around the paper cup. Do you ever feel guilty for being tired? She asked quietly. Ethan frowned. What do you mean? Charlie stared down at the coffee swirling gently in her hands. Like, people depend on you so much that you stop being a person. Her voice softened further. You become a solution. A machine. Something useful. Ethan watched her carefully now. And if you break for even 1 second, Charlie swallowed hard. Everybody looks disappointed. The words hung heavily between them. Ethan studied her face quietly. She was trying so hard to sound calm. Controlled. But beneath it he could hear something dangerously close to burnout. He had seen it before in architects working 80-hour weeks before deadlines. People who kept functioning long after they stopped feeling alive. Charlie stared toward the windows again. Tonight was supposed to be important, she admitted softly. Big dinner. Big smiles. Big speeches. She laughed bitterly under her breath. I could not breathe in that room anymore. Ethan tilted his head slightly. Family? Charlie paused too long before answering. Something like that. Ethan knew immediately there was more to the story, but he did not press. Whatever life Charlie came from, it clearly carried weight she was struggling to hold tonight. He glanced toward her expensive heels resting beside the bench, the diamond earrings still glinting faintly beneath loose strands of blonde hair, the elegance she could not completely hide no matter how exhausted she looked. Charlie belonged to a world Ethan had spent years designing buildings for but never truly entering. Wealth. Influence. High society. Yet somehow she had ended up alone on a freezing bridge at midnight. That thought lingered heavily in his chest. Charlie looked over suddenly and caught him staring. What? Ethan looked away quickly. Nothing. That was definitely not nothing. Ethan hesitated before shrugging lightly. You do not seem like somebody who usually spends nights hiding in abandoned train stations. Charlie let out a soft laugh. And you do? Fair point. Another silence passed. Then Charlie noticed the leather folder resting beside Ethan's boots. One corner had split slightly from water damage, revealing rolled papers inside. What is that? She asked. Ethan glanced down. Just work stuff. Charlie raised an eyebrow slightly. At midnight? Ethan hesitated before finally pulling several papers from the folder carefully. Blueprints. Sketches. Structural drawings marked with faded pencil lines. Charlie blinked in surprise. You made these? Ethan nodded once, suddenly looking almost embarrassed. Before everything fell apart. Charlie shifted closer instinctively beneath the blanket as Ethan spread the papers carefully across the bench between them. Even in the dim flickering light, the drawings were beautiful. Detailed community spaces. Parks. Small apartment buildings with rooftop gardens. Sunlight studies sketched into margins. Tiny handwritten notes about playground safety and wheelchair access. Charlie stared at one page longer than the others. A small community center surrounded by trees with huge glass windows flooding the interior with light. This is incredible, she whispered honestly. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. It never got built. Charlie looked up. Why not? Ethan smiled faintly, but sadness shadowed it immediately. Funding disappeared after the investigation. He pointed toward the sketch quietly. It was supposed to be for a low-income neighborhood on the south side. After-school programs. Childcare. Counseling offices upstairs. His eyes softened slightly. A place kids could feel safe. Charlie looked back down at the drawing slowly. There was so much care in every detail. Every line felt intentional. Human. Warm. Not the cold sterile architecture she was used to seeing in corporate presentations. "You designed this for money?" she asked quietly. Ethan looked genuinely confused by the question. No, Charlie studied him silently then. Because she suddenly realized something that unsettled her deeply. Ethan had lost almost everything. His career. His marriage. His home. Yet somehow none of it had turned him cruel. Meanwhile, people in her world destroyed each other over quarterly profits while pretending to smile at charity galas. Her chest tightened painfully. Ethan carefully slid the papers back into the folder. One loose sheet slipped free accidentally and fluttered onto the floor near Charlie's feet. She reached down automatically to pick it up. But the moment she saw it, she froze. It was not a blueprint. It was a child's drawing done in messy crayon. A small house beneath a bright yellow sun. Two stick figures holding hands outside. At the bottom, crooked blue letters read, "I love you, Dad. Love, Noah." Charlie stared at the drawing silently while something shifted behind her eyes. Ethan reached for it gently, his expression changing instantly. Softer now. Vulnerable. "Sorry," he murmured quietly as he took the paper back carefully like something fragile. Charlie looked at him. Really looked at him. And suddenly the exhaustion in his face made sense. The loneliness. The sadness hidden beneath his calmness. Ethan slid the drawing carefully back into the folder and stared at the floor for a moment before speaking again. "He made that when he was 6. Charlie swallowed hard. "You miss him?" Ethan let out a soft breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Every second." The honesty of it hit her harder than she expected. Ethan did not try to sound strong. Did not pretend he was fine. He just told the truth. Charlie looked away quickly, blinking against sudden emotion gathering unexpectedly in her chest. Because somewhere deep down she recognized the same loneliness in him that had driven her onto that bridge tonight. Different worlds. Different lives. Same emptiness. Ethan noticed her expression immediately. "Hey," he said gently. Charlie shook her head once. "I am okay." Ethan studied her quietly. "You do not have to keep saying that if it is not true." The words landed directly in the center of her chest. Charlie looked down instantly because for one terrifying second she thought she might cry again. And the worst part was not that Ethan saw through her. It was how safe she suddenly felt being seen. The storm finally began weakening sometime after 3 in the morning, but neither Ethan nor Charlie noticed right away. The old station had settled into a strange fragile calm now, the kind that only exists between exhausted strangers sharing pieces of themselves they never intended to say out loud. The portable heater buzzed softly beside them while snow drifted lazily beyond the windows instead of crashing violently against the glass like before. Charlie sat with the blanket wrapped tightly around her legs, staring absent-mindedly at the child's drawing Ethan had carefully tucked back into his folder several minutes earlier. She could still picture the crooked blue letters in her mind. "I love you, Dad. Love, Noah." Something about it would not leave her chest alone. Ethan leaned back against the wall nearby, arms folded loosely as fatigue finally started catching up with him. The dark circles beneath his eyes looked heavier now in the dim yellow light. Charlie realized he must have been awake nearly 20 hours. "You should sleep for a little while," she said quietly. Ethan shook his head immediately. "I am fine." Charlie gave him a look. "That is becoming your favorite lie." Ethan smiled faintly without opening his eyes. "You notice everything?" "Probably too much." Ethan glanced toward her then, studying her carefully for a second before speaking again. "You still have not told me what happened tonight." Charlie's expression changed instantly. Ethan regretted the question the moment he saw her retreat inward again. "Forget it," he said softly. "You do not owe me anything." Charlie stared down at her hands for a long moment while the station hummed quietly around them. Finally she spoke. "Do you know what the worst part of success is?" Ethan frowned slightly. I would not know. A sad smile touched Charlie's lips. People stop asking if you are happy. Ethan stayed silent. Charlie leaned back against the bench slowly, eyes fixed on the ceiling above them. At first everybody celebrates you. They say you are inspiring. Smart. Strong. Her voice softened. Then one day your entire life becomes performance. Ethan watched her carefully now. Charlie laughed quietly under her breath, but there was no joy in it. Perfect dinners. Perfect interviews. Perfect headlines. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket. Meanwhile you are exhausted all the time and nobody notices because your smile photographs well. Ethan felt something tighten painfully in his chest hearing that. Charlie turned toward the snow-covered windows again. Tonight there was this room full of people applauding me while I stood there feeling completely invisible. Her eyes glistened faintly in the dim light. Have you ever had a moment where you suddenly realize your life does not belong to you anymore? Ethan answered without hesitation. Yes. Charlie looked at him immediately, surprised by how quickly he answered. Ethan stared quietly toward the floor. After the investigation, he admitted softly, every conversation became about survival. Lawyers. Bills. Custody schedules. Job interviews. He rubbed his hands together slowly. I stopped recognizing myself after a while. Charlie listened silently. Ethan rarely talked this honestly to anyone anymore. Maybe because most people looked uncomfortable around failure. But Charlie did not. She just listened. There was this moment last year, Ethan continued quietly. I was sitting in my truck outside Noah's school because I could not afford a hotel after driving to Milwaukee. His jaw tightened slightly. I remember watching parents walk out carrying birthday balloons and coffee cups and thinking. He paused. Charlie waited softly. Ethan exhaled slowly. I used to be one of them. The words landed heavily between them. Charlie looked down instantly because she suddenly understood him in a way that scared her. Different lives. Same grief. Ethan lost his world publicly. Charlie was losing hers privately. But loneliness sounded exactly the same either way. Outside, snow continued falling gently across the empty streets. Ethan shifted slightly and glanced toward her heels near the bench. You know, he said lightly, trying to ease the heaviness in the room, I still cannot picture you surviving this storm voluntarily. Charlie smiled faintly. I am beginning to think I cannot either. Ethan tilted his head toward the blanket around her shoulders. Definitely not in $600 heels. Charlie froze for half a second. Ethan noticed immediately. That obvious? Charlie stared at him carefully. You know how much these cost? Ethan shrugged. I used to design hotels for rich people. Charlie laughed softly despite herself. So you have been profiling me this entire time? Ethan smirked faintly. Only a little. Charlie shook her head slowly, but warmth flickered briefly across her face again before fading. Ethan noticed the shift. The sadness always returned so quickly with her, like she was carrying something too heavy to set down. He glanced toward the windows. Dawn was still hours away. You hungry? Charlie blinked in surprise. What? Ethan crouched beside an old backpack near the heater and pulled out 2 granola bars slightly crushed from being carried around too long. 5-star dining upgraded to 6 stars. Charlie stared at him for a second before laughing quietly again. This time the sound lingered longer. Ethan handed her one of the bars. Careful, he warned. Probably expired. Charlie examined the wrapper suspiciously. That is not comforting. Builds character. She smiled as she unwrapped it. For several minutes they ate quietly while the storm softened outside. The silence between them no longer felt heavy now. It felt safe. Charlie could not remember the last time she sat somewhere without worrying about cameras, expectations, schedules, meetings, shareholders, headlines. Here there was nothing to perform. No one to impress. Just a tired man sharing stale granola bars in an abandoned station while snow fell outside. The simplicity of it almost hurt. Ethan noticed her staring again after a while. What? Charlie hesitated. Nothing. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. That was definitely not nothing. Charlie looked down at the granola wrapper in her hands before speaking softly. I think this is the first honest conversation I have had in years. Ethan's expression softened immediately. Charlie swallowed hard. That probably sounds pathetic. No, Ethan said quietly. It sounds lonely. The accuracy of the word hit her harder than expected. Charlie looked away quickly toward the windows, blinking against sudden emotion threatening her composure again. Ethan pretended not to notice, giving her space the way people rarely had in her world. After a long silence, Charlie spoke again very softly. Do you ever wish you could disappear for a little while? Ethan leaned back against the wall thoughtfully before answering. Sometimes. Charlie stared at the snowfall outside. I used to think money fixed loneliness. Ethan smiled sadly. And? Charlie's voice almost broke this time. It just buys quieter rooms to feel it in. Ethan looked at her then. Really looked at her. And for the first time all night he realized something important. Charlie was not standing on that bridge because she wanted attention. She was standing there because she was drowning silently while everyone around her applauded the performance. The thought unsettled him deeply. Before he could say anything else, a sudden vibration broke the silence. Charlie froze instantly. Her eyes darted toward the small designer purse near the bench. The phone inside continued vibrating over and over against the leather. Ethan looked away automatically to give her privacy. But Charlie stared at the purse like it contained something dangerous. The screen glowed faintly through the opening. 23 missed calls. Ethan noticed her hands trembling slightly. You should probably answer that, he said gently. Charlie looked at the phone for several long seconds before whispering something so quietly Ethan almost missed it completely. I do not want them to find me yet. The phone kept vibrating against the leather purse like a heartbeat Charlie could not escape. The glow from the screen reflected faintly across her face while snow drifted quietly outside the station windows. Ethan watched her carefully from across the bench, noticing the way her entire body had gone tense the moment the calls started coming in. Whoever was trying to reach her mattered. A lot. Charlie finally reached for the purse slowly, fingers trembling just enough for Ethan to notice. 24 missed calls now. Several unread messages stacked beneath them. Ethan caught only fragments of names before she angled the screen away instinctively. Richard. Evelyn. Board office. PR director. His eyebrows pulled together slightly. Board office? Charlie locked the screen immediately and placed the phone face down beside her like she was afraid of it. Silence settled heavily between them again. Ethan rubbed his hands together near the heater. Somebody is worried about you. Charlie laughed softly under her breath, but there was exhaustion behind it. No, she murmured quietly. They are worried about headlines. Ethan studied her carefully. The answer told him far more than she probably intended. Charlie leaned back against the bench and closed her eyes briefly. By morning there will probably be calls to every hotel in downtown Chicago. Ethan frowned. That serious? Charlie nodded faintly. People panic when important things disappear. Ethan tilted his head slightly. Important things? Charlie opened her eyes slowly and looked directly at him for the first time in several minutes. There was something sad about the way she answered. That is what I am to most people. The words sat painfully in the cold station air. Ethan did not know exactly who Charlie was yet, but every passing hour made it clearer she belonged to a world built entirely around pressure and performance. He glanced toward the expensive purse beside her again. Then toward the missed calls she had hidden so quickly. Rich people usually spent fortunes trying to look important. Charlie looked exhausted by it. Outside, the snow finally began slowing enough for distant city lights to reappear faintly through the storm. Ethan checked the cracked watch on his wrist. Nearly 4:30 in the morning. Charlie noticed. "You should probably go," she said softly. Ethan blinked. "What? You have work tomorrow." Ethan smiled faintly. "That would be impressive considering I do not currently have a job." Charlie looked down immediately, guilt flashing across her face. "Sorry." "Do not be." Ethan shrugged lightly. "Honestly, this night has been more interesting than most interviews." Charlie laughed quietly again despite herself. Ethan found himself smiling hearing it. It was strange now. A few hours earlier she had stood on a bridge looking completely broken. Now little pieces of warmth kept slipping through when she forgot to guard herself. Charlie noticed him watching her and looked away quickly toward the windows again. "You keep doing that," she murmured softly. "Doing what?" "Looking at me like you are trying to solve a puzzle." Ethan leaned back against the wall thoughtfully before answering. "Maybe I am." Charlie folded her arms tighter beneath the blanket. "And what have you figured out so far?" Ethan pretended to consider seriously. "You are definitely rich." Charlie groaned softly. "Wow. Impressive detective work." Ethan smiled slightly. "You hate your phone." "Very true." "And," he added quietly, "you spend a lot of time pretending you are okay because people depend on you staying functional." Charlie's expression changed instantly. The warmth disappeared from her face, replaced by something more vulnerable. Ethan immediately regretted saying it out loud. But Charlie surprised him by whispering softly, "That one was unfairly accurate." Ethan shrugged lightly. "I had practice." Charlie stared at him for several long seconds. There was something deeply unsettling about being understood this quickly by somebody she met only hours ago. Most people around her had known her for years and still only cared about the polished version standing in front of cameras. Ethan somehow saw through all of it sitting in an abandoned train station wearing a sweater with holes near the cuffs. The realization made her chest ache unexpectedly. Ethan stood slowly and stretched his sore shoulders. "I should probably check outside," he said quietly. "Storm looks lighter." Charlie nodded faintly while watching him walk toward the cracked station doors. He pushed them open slightly, and icy wind curled briefly through the room before he shut them again. "Roads are clearing." Charlie's stomach tightened instantly. Morning suddenly felt dangerous now. Real life waiting outside these walls again. Ethan noticed the shift in her face immediately. "Hey," he said gently. "You do not have to decide everything tonight." Charlie looked down at her hands. "That is the problem." Ethan frowned slightly. Charlie's voice dropped almost to a whisper. "Everything gets decided for me all the time." Ethan stayed quiet, sensing there was finally something she wanted to say. Charlie stared toward the snow-covered windows while gathering the courage to continue. "When you are responsible for enough people," she said slowly, "you stop belonging to yourself." Ethan leaned lightly against the wall beside the heater, listening carefully. Charlie swallowed hard. "Every choice becomes public. Every mistake becomes expensive. Every weakness becomes dangerous." Her eyes drifted toward the vibrating phone again. "Eventually you forget what honesty even feels like because everybody around you needs something." Ethan felt that sentence settle heavily in his chest. Because suddenly the loneliness in her eyes made complete sense. Charlie glanced toward him carefully. "Do you know what I thought when you grabbed my arm on that bridge?" Ethan shook his head once. Charlie's voice trembled slightly now. "I was angry." Ethan blinked in surprise. Charlie laughed softly at herself. "Not because you stopped me." Her eyes lowered. "Because for 1 second I realized I did not actually want to disappear." Silence filled the station. Ethan looked at her quietly, saying nothing. Charlie rubbed at her eyes quickly before continuing. "And that terrified me." Ethan stepped closer slowly, careful not to overwhelm her. Charlie. She shook her head once. You do not understand. Her voice cracked faintly now despite her effort to stay composed. Tomorrow morning I go back to being who everybody needs me to be. Ethan watched her carefully. And who is that? Charlie opened her mouth to answer, then stopped. Her eyes drifted toward the dark windows again where faint hints of dawn were beginning to soften the snowy skyline outside. For several long seconds she said nothing at all. Then finally she whispered something so quietly Ethan almost missed it. Someone I do not recognize anymore. Ethan's chest tightened painfully hearing that. Before he could respond, Charlie's phone suddenly lit up again beside her. This time the vibration did not stop. Incoming call. The screen illuminated the station brightly enough for Ethan to catch the name before Charlie grabbed it. Richard Hayes. Ethan looked away immediately, pretending he had not seen it. But the moment he heard the last name, something clicked quietly in the back of his mind. Hayes. The name sounded familiar. Very familiar. Charlie stood abruptly, turning away as she answered the call with shaking fingers. What? Her voice instantly changed. Colder now. Controlled. Professional. Ethan barely recognized it. He stared quietly toward the floor while Charlie listened silently to whoever was speaking on the other end. Then her shoulders stiffened visibly. No, she said sharply. I am not coming back for another press statement tonight. Ethan looked up slightly. Press statement? Charlie paced several feet away now, lowering her voice. I said I am fine. Long silence followed while snow drifted softly outside. Then Charlie closed her eyes tightly and whispered something filled with exhaustion. For once in my life, can somebody stop asking what this will look like to shareholders? Ethan's brow furrowed deeply hearing that. Shareholders. Board office. Press statements. Hayes. Suddenly the expensive clothes and endless calls made terrifyingly clear sense. Charlie ended the call abruptly and stood motionless near the windows for several seconds before slowly lowering the phone. Ethan watched her quietly while one impossible thought formed slowly in his mind. Who exactly had he spent the entire night talking to? Charlie stood near the station windows long after the call ended, her back turned toward Ethan while pale traces of dawn slowly crept across the snowy skyline outside. The phone remained clenched tightly in her hand now, though it had finally stopped vibrating. Ethan watched her carefully from several feet away, trying to piece together the fragments he had overheard. Shareholders. Press statements. Board office. Hayes. The name echoed louder in his head the more he thought about it. Every person in Chicago knew Hayes Group. Luxury hotels. Real estate. Billion-dollar developments splashed across newspapers for years. Ethan had even interviewed once for a subcontracting position connected to one of their expansion projects before his life unraveled. His stomach tightened slowly. No. It could not be. Charlie finally exhaled shakily and rubbed both hands over her face before turning back toward him. The moment she looked at Ethan, her carefully controlled expression faltered slightly again. Softer now. Human. But Ethan noticed something else too. Fear. I should go, she said quietly. Ethan nodded once even though something about the idea suddenly bothered him more than it should. Storm looks manageable now. Charlie glanced toward the windows uncertainly. Snow still drifted steadily outside, though the violent winds had mostly disappeared. The city was beginning to wake slowly beneath the pale blue light of early morning. Ethan stood and reached for his folder near the heater while Charlie carefully folded the old wool blanket beside the bench. Neither of them spoke for several long seconds. The silence felt different now. Heavy. Fragile somehow. Like both of them understood this strange little world inside the station was ending. Charlie slipped Ethan's coat carefully from her shoulders and held it out toward him. Here. Ethan looked at the coat, then at her thin silk blouse beneath the expensive camel-colored overcoat she had put back on. Keep it until you get somewhere warm. Charlie shook her head immediately. Ethan. I mean it. Charlie stared at him quietly. Nobody in her world gave things away without calculating the cost first. Ethan offered kindness like breathing. Simple. Natural. Uncomplicated. That realization unsettled her more deeply with every passing hour. She stepped closer and gently placed the coat into his hands anyway. You need this more than I do. Their fingers brushed briefly as he took it back. Both of them noticed. Neither acknowledged it. Ethan cleared his throat softly and slipped the coat on while Charlie adjusted the strap of her purse nervously. Then suddenly Ethan heard himself asking the question before fully deciding to. Charlie, she looked up immediately. Ethan hesitated carefully. Who are you? The question hung quietly between them. Charlie's expression changed instantly. Not defensive exactly. Sad. Tired. Like she knew this moment had been coming since the phone call started. She glanced toward the windows again before answering softly. Someone very exhausted. Ethan almost smiled despite himself. I figured that part out already. Charlie looked down briefly. If I tell you the truth, she said quietly, this becomes real. Ethan frowned slightly. What does that mean? Charlie laughed softly under her breath, but there was no humor in it. It means tomorrow morning you will wake up and realize this whole night was insane. Ethan studied her face carefully now. Charlie took one slow breath before finally speaking. My name is Charlotte Hayes. Silence filled the station instantly. Ethan stared at her while the words settled heavily into place. Charlotte Hayes. CEO of Hayes Group. One of the most recognizable business figures in Chicago. Magazine covers. Charity galas. Interviews playing silently on televisions in airport lounges and hotel bars. Ethan suddenly saw it all at once. The elegance. The security calls. The board office. The pressure hidden beneath her exhaustion. Charlotte watched realization spread slowly across his face, and somehow that hurt more than she expected. Because for a few hours inside this forgotten station, she had simply been Charlie. Not a headline. Not a company. Not a public image everyone depended on. Just a lonely woman talking honestly with a stranger. Ethan blinked once, still processing. You are, Charlotte nodded faintly before he could finish. Yes. Ethan let out a slow breath and leaned back against the bench slightly. Wow. Charlotte looked away quickly, almost bracing herself for the shift she always saw after people recognized her. Excitement. Curiosity. Opportunism. Distance. But when Ethan finally spoke again, his voice remained strangely calm. That explains the $600 shoes. Charlotte looked back at him in surprise. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. Sorry. He laughed softly under his breath. I spent the entire night giving survival advice to one of the richest women in Illinois. To Charlotte's shock, she laughed. Really laughed this time. The sound echoed warmly through the station before fading into something smaller and sadder again. Ethan watched her carefully. Why were you really on that bridge? Charlotte's smile disappeared completely. She stared toward the snowy windows for several seconds before answering. Because I could not breathe anymore. Ethan stayed silent. Charlotte wrapped her arms around herself tightly beneath her coat. Yesterday morning started with investors threatening to pull out of a redevelopment project. Her voice grew distant now, almost numb. Then a board meeting. Then press interviews. Then another dinner pretending everything was under control. Ethan listened quietly while dawn slowly brightened outside. Charlotte swallowed hard. My father built Hayes Group from nothing. Ethan recognized the name immediately now. Richard Hayes. Legendary businessman. Ruthless reputation. After he died, Charlotte continued softly, everybody expected me to become him. Her eyes drifted downward. Strong. Untouchable. Perfect. Ethan frowned slightly. And? Charlotte looked at him with heartbreaking honesty. I do not think I can anymore. The confession lingered heavily in the cold station air. Ethan understood suddenly this was not about weakness. It was exhaustion stretched beyond human limits for too long. Charlotte had spent years carrying an empire while quietly disappearing inside it. Ethan looked down briefly before speaking carefully. You know, for what it is worth, Charlotte waited softly. Ethan met her eyes again. The woman I met tonight does not seem weak to me. Something fragile flickered across Charlotte's face then. Almost like she wanted desperately to believe him. But before she could answer, headlights suddenly flashed through the snowy station windows outside. Both of them froze instinctively. Black SUVs rolled slowly toward the front entrance through the snow. Expensive. Polished. Official. Charlotte's expression collapsed instantly. Ethan glanced toward her. Your people? Charlotte nodded faintly, shoulders sinking with visible defeat. Car doors opened outside. Men in dark coats stepped into the snow, speaking urgently into phones. Ethan looked back at Charlotte and saw something painful settle over her face. Not relief. Resignation. Like Cinderella hearing midnight strike. For one impossible night she escaped the life crushing her. Now it had come to collect her again. One of the men spotted movement through the station windows. Miss Hayes. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. Ethan suddenly hated the sound of that name. Miss Hayes. Cold. Formal. Distant. Nothing like Charlie. She turned toward him slowly while voices echoed outside the station doors. I should go. Ethan nodded once, even though something in his chest tightened painfully hearing it. Charlotte stepped closer carefully. Thank you, she whispered. Ethan looked at her quietly. Charlotte's eyes glistened faintly now. For seeing me before you knew who I was. Ethan swallowed hard unexpectedly. Outside, the voices grew closer. Charlotte hesitated for one final second before reaching into her purse and pulling out a small silver business card case. She removed one card carefully and handed it to him. Ethan glanced down at the elegant lettering. Charlotte Hayes. Chief Executive Officer. Hayes Group International. Ethan looked back up slowly. Charlotte offered him the saddest smile he had seen all night. In case you ever decide you want your life complicated again. Then before Ethan could answer, the station doors swung open behind her and the outside world came rushing violently back in. The warmth inside the station disappeared the moment the doors opened. Cold air rushed through the room alongside polished black shoes, expensive wool coats, and the sharp controlled energy of people used to fixing problems quickly. Two security men entered first, scanning the station instinctively before relaxing the second they saw Charlotte standing safely near the windows. Behind them came a silver-haired man in an immaculate navy overcoat, his jaw tense with barely concealed frustration. Ethan immediately recognized him from business magazines. Richard Hayes. Charlotte's uncle and acting chairman of Hayes Group. The older man stopped the instant he saw Ethan standing nearby. His eyes narrowed slightly before shifting back to Charlotte. Charlotte, he said sharply, relief and irritation colliding in the same breath. Do you have any idea what kind of chaos this has caused? Charlotte's expression shut down instantly. Ethan watched the transformation happen in real time. The vulnerable woman from the bridge vanished behind polished control. Good morning to you too, Richard. Richard ignored the sarcasm completely as he stepped closer. Your phone was off for 6 hours. The press is already speculating. Investors are demanding explanations. Charlotte folded her arms tightly. I needed air. Richard stared at her in disbelief. You disappeared during a corporate crisis. Ethan shifted uncomfortably near the heater, suddenly feeling very out of place in the middle of whatever this was. Charlotte noticed immediately. Enough, she said coldly. Not here. Richard finally looked toward Ethan again. His gaze moved slowly over Ethan's worn coat, weathered boots, and old leather folder. The judgment was instant and unmistakable. "And who exactly is this?" The room grew quiet. Ethan opened his mouth first. "Nobody important." But Charlotte answered at the exact same time. "The reason I am alive." Silence hit the station like a physical force. One of the security men lowered his eyes immediately. Richard's expression hardened slightly as he processed the meaning behind her words. Ethan looked at Charlotte in surprise, but she kept her gaze fixed firmly on her uncle. "Ethan found me on the bridge," she continued calmly. "He stayed with me all night during the storm." Richard glanced toward Ethan again, differently this time. Less dismissive now. More calculating. "I see." Ethan suddenly wished very badly to leave. This entire world felt too polished, too tense, too powerful. Nothing like the quiet honesty of a few minutes ago. Charlotte seemed to feel it too. She stepped toward Ethan slightly. "Can I speak to you for a second?" Richard checked his watch impatiently but said nothing as Charlotte gently guided Ethan several feet away near the cracked station windows. Snow still drifted softly outside while early morning traffic slowly returned to the streets. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Ethan stared toward the city skyline while Charlotte searched his face carefully. "I am sorry," she said quietly. Ethan looked at her. "For what?" Charlotte glanced back toward the group waiting near the entrance. "For them ruining this place." Ethan smiled faintly despite everything. Honestly, this station was already kind of ruined. To his relief, Charlotte laughed softly. But sadness lingered behind it. "I mean it." Her voice lowered. "Last night felt real." Ethan swallowed unexpectedly. "Yeah." Silence settled briefly between them again. Charlotte reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper before handing it to him. Ethan frowned slightly and opened it carefully. An address. Downtown Chicago. Top floor. Hayes Group headquarters. Along with a handwritten note beneath it. Tuesday. 10 a.m. Ethan looked up in confusion. Charlotte tucked loose blonde hair behind one ear nervously, suddenly looking less like a billionaire CEO and more like the exhausted woman from the bridge again. "You said the community center project never got built." Ethan blinked once. "Charlotte, I looked at those blueprints for 2 hours tonight." Her eyes met his carefully. "Nobody designs spaces like that anymore." Ethan stared at her silently while she continued. "Most architects design for investors. You designed for people." Something tightened painfully in Ethan's chest hearing that. Because nobody had talked about his work like that in years. Not since before everything collapsed. Charlotte took one slow breath. Hayes Group owns several redevelopment properties on the south side. Ethan frowned slightly, trying to follow. "There is one project in particular that has been stalled for months because every proposal feels cold and corporate and wrong." Her voice softened. "I think maybe you could help." Ethan stared down at the address in his hand again. "Charlotte, just come to the meeting." Ethan laughed softly under his breath, overwhelmed more than amused. "You barely know me." Charlotte's eyes held his steadily. "I know enough." The words landed harder than either of them expected. Ethan looked away briefly toward the snow outside. Part of him wanted to refuse immediately. This world had already taken enough from him once. Rich people with influence always came with strings attached eventually. But another part of him, the part that still carried Noah's drawing inside his folder every day, had not heard hope spoken out loud in a very long time. Charlotte noticed the conflict flickering across his face. "No pressure," she added gently. "If you decide not to come, I understand." Ethan folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket without answering yet. Charlotte's shoulders relaxed slightly, seeing he had at least kept it. Behind them Richard cleared his throat impatiently. "Charlotte. We need to leave." She closed her eyes briefly before looking back at Ethan one last time. I should go. Ethan nodded slowly. Yeah. Another silence stretched between them, heavier this time. Neither seemed ready for the conversation to end. Finally Charlotte smiled faintly. Try not to spend too many more nights in abandoned train stations. Ethan smirked softly. No promises. She shook her head gently, still smiling. Then before either of them could overthink it, Charlotte stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him briefly. The hug caught Ethan completely off guard. She was warm despite the freezing morning air. Small. Fragile in ways she never allowed the rest of the world to see. Ethan hesitated only half a second before carefully hugging her back. For one impossible moment, the noise around them faded completely. No shareholders. No failed careers. No headlines. Just two lonely people holding on to something neither fully understood yet. Then Charlotte stepped back slowly, composure returning to her face piece by piece. The CEO mask sliding back into place. Ethan already hated it. She gave him one final look before turning toward the station doors where security waited. Richard glanced once more at Ethan as Charlotte passed him. Mr. Cole, he said calmly, surprising Ethan completely. Thank you. Ethan nodded awkwardly. Richard's expression remained unreadable. Then the group disappeared out into the snowy morning together. The black SUVs pulled away minutes later, vanishing into downtown traffic while Ethan stood alone inside the silent station holding the warmth of Charlotte's hug in his chest and a folded meeting invitation in his pocket. For a long time he stared toward the empty street outside, convincing himself he would never actually go. Then his phone buzzed quietly inside his coat. Ethan frowned and pulled it out. A text message from his ex-wife. Noah asked if you are still coming next weekend. Ethan stared at the message while snow drifted softly across the city beyond the cracked windows. Then slowly, almost without realizing it, his hand closed tighter around Charlotte's invitation. Tuesday morning arrived gray and bitterly cold, the kind of Chicago winter day where steam curled from subway grates and people walked fast with their heads lowered against the wind. Ethan stood across the street from Hayes Group headquarters with both hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, staring up at the massive glass tower disappearing into the clouds above him. The building looked less like an office and more like another world entirely. Sleek black cars rolled silently beneath the covered entrance while sharply dressed executives disappeared through revolving doors carrying coffees and briefcases that probably cost more than Ethan's truck. He checked the folded invitation in his pocket again for what had to be the 10th time. Tuesday. 10 a.m. Top floor. He still could not believe he actually came. Part of him almost turned around twice on the train ride downtown. Men like Ethan did not belong in places like this anymore. Not after everything that happened. But every time he thought about leaving, he remembered Noah's drawing tucked inside his folder and the way Charlotte looked at his blueprints inside that abandoned station. Nobody had looked at his work like it mattered in a very long time. Ethan exhaled slowly and crossed the street. The moment he stepped into the lobby, warmth wrapped around him instantly along with polished marble floors, soft instrumental piano music, and the faint scent of expensive coffee. Everything gleamed. The ceiling stretched nearly 3 stories high with modern chandeliers hanging like floating glass sculptures overhead. Ethan suddenly became painfully aware of the scuffed edges of his boots. Several people glanced toward him briefly as he approached the front desk. Not rude exactly. Just curious. Like they were trying to figure out how someone like him wandered in here. A young receptionist looked up politely. Good morning, sir. Can I help you? Ethan cleared his throat slightly. I am here to see Charlotte Hayes. The receptionist blinked once in visible surprise before recovering professionally. Do you have an appointment? Ethan pulled the folded note carefully from his coat pocket and handed it over. The woman's expression changed instantly the moment she recognized the handwriting. One moment, please. She picked up the phone quickly while Ethan stood awkwardly beneath the massive chandelier trying not to look completely out of place. Several seconds later her polite smile returned. Ms. Hayes is expecting you. 32nd floor. Ethan nodded once. Thanks. The elevator ride felt strangely unreal. Soft jazz played quietly overhead while Chicago's skyline slowly unfolded through the glass walls as the elevator climbed higher and higher. Ethan caught his reflection briefly in the mirrored doors. Tired eyes. Worn coat. Nervous expression he was failing to hide. He looked like a man showing up to the wrong interview. The doors finally opened onto a private executive floor so quiet it almost felt like a museum. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire space, revealing snow-covered rooftops stretching endlessly across downtown Chicago. Assistants moved quickly between sleek glass offices carrying tablets and coffee trays while conversations happened in low urgent voices. Ethan stepped out slowly, immediately overwhelmed. Then he heard her voice. Ethan. He turned instantly. Charlotte walked toward him from the far end of the hallway wearing a fitted cream-colored coat over a dark green dress, her blonde hair pinned neatly back while sunlight from the windows caught softly against her face. She looked completely different from the woman in the abandoned station. Polished. Elegant. Powerful. But the moment she smiled at him, he saw Charlie again underneath all of it. Something in his chest tightened unexpectedly. Hi, Ethan said quietly. Charlotte slowed slightly as she reached him, studying his face carefully like she was genuinely relieved he came. You actually showed up. Ethan gave a faint shrug. Still deciding if this was a terrible idea. Charlotte laughed softly. Fair. The sound instantly eased some of the tension in his shoulders. Several employees nearby glanced toward them curiously before quickly pretending not to stare. Ethan noticed. Charlotte noticed him noticing. Ignore them, she murmured quietly. People here get overly interested whenever I smile. Ethan smirked faintly. Sounds exhausting. You have no idea. For half a second they simply stood there looking at each other while the busy office moved around them. Then Charlotte motioned gently toward a large conference room overlooking the city. Come on. Ethan followed her inside. The room was stunning. A massive oak table stretched across polished stone floors while snow drifted outside enormous windows framing the Chicago skyline like artwork. Several architectural models sat displayed along one wall beside digital project renderings glowing on large screens. Ethan immediately noticed one particular model in the center of the room. A redevelopment block on the south side. Modern apartment towers. Retail spaces. Cold. Efficient. Soulless. Charlotte caught the look on his face immediately. Exactly, she said quietly. Ethan glanced toward her. Exactly what? Charlotte crossed her arms loosely. That expression. She nodded toward the model. Every consultant who walks in here talks about profitability. Investment flow. Marketability. Her eyes shifted toward the miniature buildings. Nobody talks about people. Ethan stepped closer to the model slowly. This neighborhood already has enough glass luxury towers. Charlotte watched him carefully now. Tell me what it needs. Ethan hesitated briefly before instinct took over. He pointed toward a narrow space between buildings. Open this up. Charlotte tilted her head slightly. Ethan stepped closer, studying the model like muscle memory suddenly waking back up inside him. You are blocking natural light through the entire street level. He pointed again. And nobody is going to use these public spaces because they feel designed for appearances instead of actual families. Charlotte's expression sharpened with interest immediately. Ethan barely noticed now. He was too focused. You need community anchors. He gestured toward another section. Childcare. After-school areas. Shared green spaces people actually feel welcome inside. Charlotte stared at him quietly while something shifted in the room. Ethan came alive when he talked about design. The exhaustion faded slightly from his face. His hands moved instinctively across the model as ideas connected rapidly in his mind. Passion replaced hesitation. Charlotte felt her chest tighten unexpectedly watching him. Because for the first time in months, somebody was speaking honestly inside this building instead of trying to impress her. Ethan finally stopped himself suddenly and stepped back awkwardly. Sorry. Charlotte blinked slightly. Why are you apologizing? Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. I got carried away. A soft smile touched Charlotte's face. Good. Ethan looked at her carefully. Charlotte stepped closer to the model beside him. This project has been sitting dead for almost 8 months. Her voice lowered slightly. You spent 4 minutes looking at it and already saw more humanity in it than my entire board. Ethan glanced down at the model again quietly. People deserve spaces that feel like someone cared when they built them. Charlotte stared at him for a second too long after he said it. Ethan noticed immediately and looked away first. Before either of them could say anything else, the conference room doors suddenly opened behind them. A sharply dressed man in his 40s stepped inside carrying a tablet. He stopped instantly when he saw Ethan standing beside Charlotte. Surprise flickered briefly across his face before disappearing behind a polished corporate smile. Charlotte, he said smoothly. The board meeting starts in 15 minutes. His eyes shifted toward Ethan carefully. I did not realize we had outside consultants joining us today. Something about the man's tone immediately put Ethan on edge. Charlotte's expression cooled slightly. This is Ethan Cole. The man extended a hand politely enough. Daniel Mercer. Chief Financial Officer. Ethan shook it briefly. Daniel's smile remained perfectly professional, but his eyes lingered thoughtfully on Ethan's worn coat and old leather folder before returning to Charlotte. Interesting timing, he said lightly. Considering the press is still obsessed with your little disappearance over the weekend. Charlotte's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Ethan noticed. Daniel smiled again, calm and controlled. Should I prepare an additional confidentiality agreement for Mr. Cole? Silence flickered sharply across the room. Ethan immediately understood what Daniel was really asking. Can this man be trusted around our secrets? Charlotte's voice turned cold instantly. That will not be necessary. Daniel held her gaze for one long second before nodding politely. Of course. Then he glanced once more toward Ethan. Welcome to Hayes Group, Mr. Cole. But the moment he left the room, Ethan looked at Charlotte quietly and said the first thing that came to mind. That guy hates me already. To Ethan's surprise, Charlotte laughed softly under her breath before muttering something he definitely did not expect from a billionaire CEO. Good. That means your instincts still work. The boardroom felt colder than the Chicago streets outside. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the massive oval table while gray winter light spilled across polished wood and crystal water glasses placed with perfect precision in front of every leather chair. Ethan sat near the far end of the room trying very hard not to look as uncomfortable as he felt. Around him, some of the most powerful people in Chicago flipped through financial reports worth more money than he would probably see in several lifetimes. Men and women in tailored suits spoke quietly about investments, media perception, and acquisition timelines while assistants moved silently along the walls refilling coffee cups. Ethan suddenly missed the abandoned train station more than ever. Across the table, Charlotte sat at the head of the room with effortless authority, reviewing documents while speaking calmly with several board members. Watching her now felt surreal compared to the woman standing on the bridge only days earlier. Here she was composed. Sharp. Untouchable. Every eye in the room followed her automatically. But Ethan noticed something nobody else seemed to. The exhaustion was still there. Hidden carefully beneath posture and professionalism, but there. Daniel Mercer sat 3 chairs to Charlotte's right, scrolling through numbers on a tablet while occasionally glancing toward Ethan with polite suspicion he was not bothering to hide anymore. Ethan shifted slightly in his chair and looked down at the folder in front of him. Charlotte had insisted he bring his community center concepts to the meeting after reviewing his notes upstairs earlier that morning. He still was not entirely sure why he agreed. Probably because she looked at his work like it mattered. Probably because part of him wanted to believe maybe his life was not over yet. Richard Hayes entered the room moments later, immediately commanding attention without raising his voice once. "Let us begin." The conversations faded instantly. Ethan sat quietly while the meeting launched into discussions about stalled development projects across Chicago. Profit margins. Investor confidence. Construction delays. Everything moved fast, polished, efficient. Like everyone here had rehearsed these conversations 1,000 times before. Charlotte listened carefully while occasionally asking questions sharp enough to make entire sections of the room fall silent. Ethan found himself watching her more than the presentations. She belonged here in ways she clearly no longer believed herself. 40 minutes into the meeting, Daniel finally turned toward the redevelopment project model Ethan reviewed earlier upstairs. "Southside community expansion," he announced smoothly. "Current investor confidence remains unstable due to rising infrastructure costs and reduced luxury interest." Ethan frowned slightly hearing luxury interest attached to a neighborhood project. Daniel continued calmly. "Our consultants recommend maintaining the current design structure to maximize long-term profitability." Charlotte leaned back slightly in her chair. "And what exactly does that maximize for the neighborhood?" Several board members exchanged glances immediately. Daniel's smile remained calm. "Charlotte, with respect, this is still a business." Ethan noticed her jaw tighten faintly. "Housing is also people." Silence flickered briefly around the table. Daniel adjusted his glasses smoothly before continuing. "Which is why the current proposal includes public spaces." Ethan glanced toward the digital renderings displayed on the screen. Sterile towers. Decorative parks nobody would actually use. Expensive coffee shops replacing local businesses. He had seen projects like this before. Neighborhoods redesigned until the people living there no longer belonged inside them. Charlotte looked toward Ethan suddenly. "You disagree?" Every head in the room turned toward him instantly. Ethan froze for half a second. Daniel's expression barely shifted, but amusement flickered behind his eyes. Ethan cleared his throat quietly. "I just think." He hesitated briefly. People can tell when a place was built for investors instead of families. The room went still. Daniel leaned back slowly. "Interesting perspective." Ethan instantly recognized the tone. Corporate translation for this should be entertaining. But Charlotte simply nodded once toward him. "Go on." Ethan glanced at the project model again before standing slowly. Every instinct in him screamed this was a terrible idea. But once he started speaking, something old inside him woke up again. "The problem with this layout," he explained carefully, pointing toward the digital rendering, "is that nobody living there will actually feel ownership over these spaces." Several board members frowned slightly. Ethan continued. "You have luxury retail at street level surrounded by temporary social areas. Families will walk through it, not stay." Daniel folded his hands calmly. "And your solution?" Ethan pointed toward several sections of the design. "Shift resources into community anchors instead of visual branding." His voice steadied more confidently now. "Childcare centers. Public courtyards. Shared green areas connected directly to residential units." He glanced toward the room carefully. "If people feel emotionally connected to where they live, neighborhoods survive longer than investment trends." Silence settled across the table. Ethan realized suddenly everyone was staring at him. Not dismissively anymore. Thinking. Charlotte watched him quietly from the head of the table while something almost impossible softened behind her eyes. Pride. Daniel broke the silence first with a measured smile. "And where exactly did you study urban development strategy, Mr. Cole?" Ethan met his gaze calmly. "Northwestern." Daniel blinked once, clearly not expecting that answer. "Architecture and structural design." Ethan added quietly. Several board members shifted now, reassessing him completely. Daniel recovered quickly. Impressive. But the word carried something sharper underneath now. Ethan recognized it instantly. Threat assessment. Richard Hayes finally spoke for the first time in several minutes. You worked for Halston Development, correct? Ethan's stomach tightened slightly. Yes. Silence flickered again around the room. Everyone in Chicago's development industry remembered the Halston scandal. Unsafe materials. Corruption investigations. Headlines everywhere. Daniel leaned back slowly, voice smooth as polished glass. Ah. There it was. Ethan felt the atmosphere shift instantly. Board members exchanging looks now. Quiet calculations happening behind expensive eyes. Daniel continued carefully. That was unfortunate business. Ethan's jaw tightened. People got hurt. Daniel gave a sympathetic nod. And your career suffered considerably afterward, if I remember correctly. Charlotte's eyes lifted sharply toward Daniel. Ethan kept his expression calm with effort. I reported the violations. Daniel smiled lightly. Of course. The way he said it made Ethan's stomach turn. Richard studied Ethan carefully now. You were never formally charged with wrongdoing. No, Ethan answered quietly. Daniel folded his hands. Still, he said smoothly, public perception matters in development projects this sensitive. Ethan understood exactly what was happening now. The room had gone from curious to cautious the second his past entered the conversation. Daniel turned toward Charlotte politely. I simply think we should be careful involving emotionally connected outside voices in active redevelopment decisions. Emotionally connected. Ethan almost laughed at the wording. Such a clean corporate way to imply unstable, compromised, dangerous. Charlotte remained completely still for several long seconds. Then finally she spoke. Daniel. His eyes lifted toward her immediately. Charlotte's voice stayed calm. Too calm. Are you questioning Mr. Cole's professional insight? Daniel smiled faintly. Not at all. He glanced toward Ethan. I am questioning whether personal relationships are beginning to influence corporate decision-making. Silence hit the room hard. Ethan felt his chest tighten instantly. There it was. The real accusation. Not about architecture. About Charlotte. About why he was here at all. Several board members looked visibly uncomfortable now. Ethan stared down at the table briefly, humiliation creeping slowly into his chest. Of course this would happen. Men like Daniel saw people like Ethan the same way every wealthy executive eventually did. Opportunists. Charity cases. Problems waiting to happen. Ethan slowly reached for his folder. Maybe I should go. Charlotte's voice stopped him instantly. No, the single word cut cleanly through the room. Ethan looked up. Charlotte sat perfectly still at the head of the table, her blue eyes locked directly onto Daniel now. Cold. Sharp. Dangerous in a way Ethan had not seen before. Mr. Cole was invited here because his ideas have more humanity than anything presented in this room for the last 8 months. Nobody moved. Charlotte's gaze never left Daniel's face. And if anyone here believes kindness automatically means manipulation, her voice lowered slightly. That says far more about this board than it does about him. Complete silence followed. Even Daniel looked briefly caught off guard. Ethan stared at Charlotte while something shifted painfully inside his chest. Because for the first time in years, somebody powerful was standing beside him instead of stepping away.